everyone. My apologies for missing our class on Monday. But since we are covering lecture material on the Christians, and since you are working on your midterms, I thought I'd give you a little bit of time to do that and record a lecture on this portion of the Christians. I also apologize for the amount of time it's taken me to get it to you. I did record all of this yesterday, and then it turned out that it didn't record my voice, the sound, nothing, and so I got a bit frustrated. Technology has been worked out, and now we're ready to go. And this is where we left off when last we met, Wednesday of last week. And so I wanted to begin with this portion. And what we have in front of us, the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, is the material that we left off with. This is a sarcophagus of someone who's obviously a Christian in the Roman world. We can tell that they're a Christian because of the scenes on the front of the image of the sarcophagus. Now, sarcophagus here is a place where the bones of the burned body would have been put. So it's not as big as a coffin. It's not, the full length, the full 6-foot-long coffin-type shape. Instead, the Romans would go off and they would burn the body, but the fire isn't going to burn up all the parts of the body, still left with the bones, and they would take the bones and they would put them into these sarcophagi. Or actually, inside of the sarcophagus, I believe it's a little ossuary where the bones are. At any rate, we know that this is a Christian on the outside because we have some Old Testament imagery here on the left-hand side, and then we have images of Jesus here in the top and on the bottom. So, not just a Jewish person inside, but someone who obviously was a follower of Jesus, of Christ. So the 359 CE date here also means that this is a work that was made when Christianity was legal, not when Christianity was fully the religion of the Roman world, just legalized at this point. And so therefore don't have to worry about vandalism or etc. So, let's look at some close-ups here. Bottom left-hand side of the sarcophagus, you can see an image here on the bottom left of Job, the story of Job. This is Job seated on his pile of dung. You can see that the artist has also carved these Roman-style columns to separate off each one of these individual panels. A little bit like a comic book, actually. So you have a panel here that deals with Job. You have a panel here that deals with Adam and Eve. There you see Adam and Eve, the tree in between them. The body of the snake would have curled around the tree. They have eaten of the tree because we see them ashamed of their physical bodies, covering themselves. Eve here is close to a lamb, whereas Adam is close to the sheaves of wheat, connecting him to caring for the farmland and growing the crops and industry, connecting her to animals, reproduction, concepts like that. So on top you see an arch, and each one of these arches is a bit different, and then in between the arches you'll see these little mythological creatures. So there's a mixture here, even on the front, of very much Roman imagery and then also Judeo-Christian imagery. In the center, we have a couple of interesting images. One here on the bottom seems to come from an apocryphal story, and an apocryphal story means something that's not thought to have been real or true part of the religious narrative. In this situation, in this case, we have something that looks fairly common. Lots of imagery of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and here he is riding on a donkey. But instead we have these two men hanging out in a tree who seem to be sort of springing out at him. And that seems to be based on a story where, again, an apocryphal story where Jesus was riding on a road. I think he was on the road to Jerusalem, and he was attacked by two robbers, and then he ends up converting them. It's not a common image at all. In fact, I think this is the only example of it. The one on top is also not common. Let me backtrack and say it is the only example of this exact imagery, but it is very, very similar to other images of Jesus that are called Jesus enthroned images or icons. And the similarities here are as Jesus is seated in a throne. He has a scroll in one hand. In his other hand, he would have had probably his two fingers extended in that imperial gesture that we saw last time. That's most likely what it would have been, but unfortunately it's broken off. At his feet is this strange old man bending something over his head, which is really an unclear portion of the image. Very unsure what that is supposed to be. And on either side of him are probably Peter and Paul in the Peter and Paul. I think I may have been moving my mouse around. You may not have been able to see it. Anyway, on either side of him here, Peter and Paul. But in the Jesus enthroned images, the icons from later, what you'll see on either side of him are Mary and John the Baptist. So the same sort of orientation. You have Jesus seated on a throne. You have two people on either side of him. You have something at his feet. This will change when it becomes the full icon of Jesus enthroned to be, like I said, Mary and John the Baptist on either side. And at his feet, instead of this old man, what you'll see is the representation of a city. So what we see with this is the development of Christian iconography. And it's coming out of a shift in Roman art to a much more symbolic style, a much more symbolic approach, somewhat reminiscent of this Missorium of Theodosius. You see the same sort of seated figures holding something in their hands as we have the two sons here. They also have their little hands up. He has his hand up in that imperial gesture. The emperor here in the center, interestingly enough, does not have his little imperial gesture. But that seated approach, what you'll see in many later or roughly parallel as far as time is concerned, 4th and 5th century images of Jesus enthroned, you'll see the same leg positions, the same robes draping over the legs. Jesus in one image, in I think it's the apse of one of the churches in Ravenna, he actually has a globe in his hand. Even though, they didn't think of the world necessarily as being a globe. That globe represents the heavens, and he has his fingers in his hand extended in that sort of imperial gesture, much like what you see here. So a very, very close representation. And obviously we have the same artists who are engaged in making this art, so they are using these techniques that they're discovering or that they're using in Roman art. But you also have a much more symbolic style. Roman patrons are much less interested in having something 100% accurate, naturalistic, a copy of their face, a literal version of them. They're much less interested in that, and they want a symbolic style, and they want an image that actually communicates something. It tells a story. This could be related to a decline in literacy in the Roman world in the empire. It was a rapid decline, that's for sure. It could be related to a need for symbolism to communicate with people who didn't speak Latin, right? Spreading into, as the empire is spreading into territories that are not are not places where people speak Latin or Greek, and maybe that's a part of it. Maybe it's part of having a larger multicultural community of non-Latin and Greek speakers. That's inside of the empire that could be a part of it. It could also be an attempt to communicate more succinctly concepts of power rather than having to write things out. And so that lends itself to being less humanistic, less vague, as we'll see, as you saw in the statue of Octavian, where you really have to concentrate kind of on reading that statue because you're first confronted by this divinely perfect human body. And maybe the thought is that that gets in the way. And really, what the emperor wants is he just wants a statement of, I am the leader, I'm the most powerful, but I'm here to help you. And let's get to that really quickly. And that approach, that idea of communicate the message, don't worry about concepts of humanism or concepts of naturalism, etc., could very well have influenced Christianity. The thought is, of course, that Christianity is oriented around poorer communities. That turns out not to really be true at all. Actually, it was mostly wealthier Roman citizens. But it does need to communicate with people who are not literate. And so, making art that does that may be one of the reasons that Christian art borrows this highly symbolic approach. I also wanted to point out here that this is the Missorium of Theodosius. Theodosius is the emperor who legalizes, not just legalizes, he makes Christianity the only official religion of the Roman Empire. So he was definitely a Christian. And what you see in the iconography is a typical Roman artist approach to representing the emperor, and that is to have this nimbus around his head. You can only barely see the line around his head. That is a nimbus, and that, of course, gets borrowed by Christianity and eventually develops into the halo, a symbol of divinity. That is something that comes straight from Roman representations of the emperor. And you'll see a lot of parallels, right? Borrowing this image from the emperor, borrowing the imperial gesture, borrowing the robes. I mean, there's a lot of borrowing from representations of the emperor that then get put onto the representations of Jesus. Here you have an image of Jesus here being arrested, and then it carries over actually into the next one where Pontius Pilate is washing his hands of the whole situation and convicting Jesus to crucifixion. Then you'll have here a representation of Isaac and Abraham and the attempted sacrifice and the angel delivering the lamb, etc. But on the side of this image, so on the front, here, there are all those images we were just looking at. And then on the side, you have these little figures here. These are not angels. These are assistants of Dionysus who have come to gather the grapes. You can see the little grapes here, and they're making wine. So you see this Christian imagery on the front and all this pagan imagery on the side, and you may get a sense of, is this person in the coffin here, are they confused about their own religion to be accepting all this pagan imagery? No, not at all. In fact, this is a concept that we will come back to when we get to Christianity in the Middle Ages, and it's very important to think about it when you are engaging even with the literature of Mai de France, that this pagan imagery is being borrowed extensively by Christianity as it expands into this pagan world. For the person in the coffin here, in the sarcophagus, This imagery on the side is just simply a Roman culture stuff. It's just imagery that maybe represents the beauty of life, maybe it represents the celebration of the seasons, maybe it represents the power of wine, and that also flows over into concepts of the communion, right? So there are natural linkages here. It's not to say that he necessarily believes that Dionysus is a god, or Bacchus in this situation is a god, but that this represents something culturally relevant to him. As Christianity expands into territory that is not Christian, what it does is, while adhering to core theological concepts, it borrows imagery, it borrows symbolism, it borrows traditions, and it borrows festivals from the communities into which it works its way. And you know that this already happens because I'm sure that you know Christmas is what it is, right? The festival of Saturnalia, roughly from the Roman world, which was a festival of the darkest days of the winter, the promises of the return of spring and a celebration of that moment, a celebration of that turning point, etc. And that gets borrowed by Christianity to be the celebration of the birth of Jesus. So you know things like that happen. You know that the Christmas tree is a Germanic symbol of eternal life throughout winter because it is it's an evergreen. All of these things I'm sure you're probably already to some extent aware of. But we know that it's happening intentionally because of letters that are written from a missionary in England, a man by the name of Augustine, not the Saint Augustine, but another Saint Augustine, not Saint Augustine of Hippo, but Saint Augustine of somewhere else. He went to England to convert the English, and he writes a letter back to Pope Gregory the Great, and this is in the 6th century, 5th or 6th century. And he's complaining. He says, I'm converting these English to Christianity, and then they are unconverting. They keep going back to their old ways. They keep rebuilding these temples. I burn down their temple. They go and they rebuild their temple, and they turn back to worshiping those gods. I prevent them from having these festivals to all their little deities and all these little things and Halloween festivals and all that kind of stuff. And they keep going right back to it. And so Gregory the Great writes a letter back saying, why are you doing any of that? That's not what you're supposed to be doing. What you should do is you should take their temples and you should convert them to Christian churches. They feel as though there's some sort of divine influence there. How are we supposed to know that's not the case? So you just use those temples and you convert them, and they will go to worship in that spot, and they will be eventually converted to worshiping the proper faith, as he would say. The same thing with the festivals. Don't prevent them from having these festivals. Convert those festivals into veneration days for specific saints. For example, Halloween, which you are probably, again, aware is seemingly a Celtic holiday that was most likely about a day when the gates of, well, I know that's a poor way of putting it, but when evil spirits were very powerful for some reason, and you'd spend the night going around making a lot of noise in order to prevent the evil spirits from doing bad things. And that gets converted into a celebration of the saints, All Saints' Day. So there you go. I'm not saying that Augustine's the one who made that decision, but that's the process that's happening. So when you see imagery like this, the person inside connects these things, these moments, to cultural traditions and is beginning to fuse them together with Christianity. And that is called syncretism. So this happens as Christianity becomes integrated with empire. And there's a whole bunch of really important history here that I'm just going to gloss over, but Constantine in 313 issues the doctrine of tolerance, the Edict of Milan, which says that no religion can be persecuted. No worshippers of any religion can be persecuted. All religions are allowed. He doesn't make Christianity the official religion of Rome. He does appear to, at some point, convert to Christianity. We know that his mother and his sister were Christians. He built a number of very important churches, including the original St. Peter's. He began this process, or is associated with this process of the veneration of important figures to the church and church history, the collecting of their remains, celebrating where they're buried, concepts like that. He calls the Council of Nicaea together in Constantinople. Well, I don't think it was in Constantinople, but he calls them together. It's Council of Nicaea, so should be in that town. But anyway, he calls them together in order to get some sort of clarity on particular theological concepts. And so, yes, very important to the development of Christianity as a religion, and sets the stage for its integration into the empire, but doesn't make that final step. It's not until Theodosius when that happens. So Theodosius makes Christianity the only religion in the Roman world, the only legal religion in the Roman world. And that takes time. Theodosius makes that declaration, and I think after Theodosius is Julian the Apostate, who goes in the other direction, and then you move back into this direction. So it goes back and forth for a little while. But eventually, Christianity and the Roman Empire become deeply integrated. So once that happens, images of Jesus are no longer those images of the poor shepherd in the field with his lambs. Instead, it's the image of an emperor, effectively, in the field with his lambs. So you have here Jesus in his golden robes, a golden nimbus around his head, a golden staff, and purple sash. And the color purple was a color that was reserved for the emperor and his family. So here, Jesus has now been integrated into the emperor's family. So that is the extent of this portion of the lecture, and I think what I'm going to do here is cut off the video at this point, and then record a further video with more of our lecture material to try to get us most of the way through the development of Christianity for this particular portion. So I will see you, or you will hear me, in a video a little bit later. Bye-bye, everyone.